Hey guys, most of you already know who I am, but for those who don't, my name is Shaylin Drake, and I am a faculty member for aviation down in Price. I teach with Sean Barstow in Price and Aviation. So this picture is of me from a very, very, very long time ago. And I have been asked in this Breaking Barriers course to kind of talk about what life was like being a female in UAS. So, for those of you that don't know, I started building and flying RC airplanes in about 2004. So, if we really think about it, those are kind of the original drone. RC airplanes have actually been around since about 1936. So, been around for a long time, and the technology that we use in the hobby world actually gets translated and incorporated into everyday drones and military drones, and then vice versa. And it's kind of gone back and forth for 100 years. So we're going to dive a little bit into my own personal experience being a female drone pilot. For much of those 20 years, I was the only female drone pilot in Utah. And so for the Breaking Barriers course, I'm going to talk about that personal experience. This picture is a little more recent. I want to say it was early spring of 2024, maybe late winter of 2023, anyway, somewhere around in there. That's one of my favorite RC airplanes to fly. It is a scale model of a Fox glider. Most of the real Fox gliders don't have motors, but this one does, obviously. So a good 10 or 11 foot wingspan, fun to fly. So the real barriers that I want to talk about are different from what you would consider stereotypical barriers. I was not necessarily rejected. I was not necessarily made fun of, pushed away, or anything like that. In fact, I got a lot of free stuff as a female, which is sort of a little bit of a reverse sexism, I guess you could say. I wasn't totally isolated or anything like that you would kind of think of as typical barriers to aviation and drones. And I'm going to talk about, though, the things that we end up accidentally doing every single day. And all of us do it. And I'm going to talk about how to kind of fix that a little bit. So the real barriers for me that I want to focus on are teaching strategies, jealousy, and careers. And the very first thing I want to point out is that falling into these traps, falling into these barriers does not necessarily make anybody a bad person. Okay, this just happens. And not everybody falls under these exact same kind of barriers. So that is a picture of my husband and I right after COVID. Actually, the orange airplane and the green airplane are both mine. And then his is the white, yellow, and blue airplane. And while he was not necessarily as bad at the teaching strategies, he was my main teacher. And he has had to kind of make some adjustments throughout our marriage, especially as I became a professor in aviation, and he's had to go through some mindset shifts. As a teacher in high school, especially, one of the things that we actually have to practice and be aware of is our biases. And some of you will get angry at me saying this, and the rest of you will be like, yeah, that's legit. Teachers treat boys differently from girls, girls differently from boys. And typically in a classroom setting, girls are held to higher expectations. Girls get in trouble more easily than boys do. That is a scientifically proven fact. It's the opposite in aviation. It's the opposite when you get into kind of hands-on STEM type situations. There are very low expectations of females in drones. They're not held to anywhere near as high a standard as the males are because they can't do it, so to speak. And then there are huge communication issues. Because a male is used to working with other males in a male-dominated arena like drones, they don't adjust. in any way, and the females have to do all the adjusting. So those communications are huge. And then when anything happens that seems to, for the male to look like it's difficult for the female, instead of holding those high expectations and saying, hey, you got this, you're on your own, they come in and say, let me do this for you because you're not capable, is not necessarily the intent, but it is the cultural expectation. Guys don't realize they're doing it. And the intent is to be a gentleman. But if you think about it, a gentleman holds doors and pulls chairs open because a woman's not capable of doing it, or that was the perception back in the day. And so that let me do this for you ends up hurting females in aviation. It ended up putting me back several years in my development as an RC, even a hobbyist. So that's one of the things to kind of look out for. When you're working with women, when you're teaching other women, and there's not necessarily a good way to avoid it, because our culture is so steeped in that dominance, especially when it comes to STEM careers and things like that. But it's kind of your job to be aware of it, basically. The part that was probably most entertaining for me, when I started to become a pretty stinking good pilot, I noticed a lot of the males in my life get really, really jealous. And it sucks, because they take it personally, for sure. And it included my husband to a large extent. And he had to recognize that and try to get over it. But when a female outshines a male in a male-dominated arena, there's two types of guys, basically, ones that are okay with it and ones that aren't. And that jealousy and those sensitive egos in the RC community and in the UAS community were really, really hard to deal with. And that was definitely a barrier that I've had to deal with throughout my entire time in aviation. The biggest one, though, I think, has to do with careers. So I started building and flying before I even had my teaching certificate, and no one would have even considered telling me, hey, maybe you ought to switch and go into engineering. Maybe you ought to switch and go into aviation. Maybe you ought to switch and consider aerospace science or something. No, that didn't even cross anyone's mind. And my life and my career path would have been completely different had it crossed anyone's minds. And I think that is probably the biggest barrier that we have. If you see a female who is good at engineering, it's harder for school counselors, harder for parents, harder for the culture to say, yeah, go into engineering. And then by the same token, if you see a female struggle with it, people automatically think, oh, they should just go into English or teaching or something. Because that's what they're good at, instead of providing the opportunity and considering that maybe a STEM career, an aviation career, even if you're quote unquote not good at it, considering that that's even a possibility, I think is the biggest deal for females. And I think, so 20 years ago, 2004 is when I started. I think we've gotten a lot better at it in the last 20 years. A lot better at it. And we still got some work to do, but these are the barriers that women have to deal with. And being a female in aviation still has a couple of major downsides. One is that whenever I am assertive, it is seen as being bossy, uptight, or emotional. It is a non-feminine quality. I am not seen as a feminine female. And that does not necessarily bother me because it's just something that I've always been like, basically. But it's an interesting element to being a female in aviation, and it would bother a lot of women. People get intimidated really easily by a woman who is assertive in aviation, and instead of saying, oh yeah, they make good leaders and they get things done, a lot of people just shy away from them because it makes them nervous. And then the women in aviation statistics, I can't decide if they're good or bad. I think they've gone up a percentage or two, but that's about it. 9% of the overall aviation population in any way, shape, or form is female. 12% of student pilots are female. It goes down a little bit for drones, only 8%, and then it doubles as faculty because that's teaching. And so kind of interesting numbers there and some barriers to consider kind of going over. So what do we all do as this? Number one thing, recognize your biases. Be aware of how you treat people, and it doesn't matter if it's male, female, different races, whatever, people that speak different languages. We all have biases, and recognizing those and just bringing awareness to them, listening instead of trying to defend yourself. Listen to what other people have to say. That's the biggest thing. For anybody that wants to know a little bit more about me and what I do, this is my email address. These are the classes that I teach. I have community engaged learning classes that help you get a Carnegie Scholar designation on your transcripts. I also teach research, scientific, and creative intensive courses, and then a communication intensive course that overlaps with some of the CEL stuff. So I am definitely into undergraduate research. I work with the Bingham Research Center and Trout Unlimited and UDOT on UAS projects, and part of Aggie Drone Academy and USU drones under Sean Barstow, and we do a lot of agricultural research and things like that. So that is kind of the success story out of breaking these barriers.